Vice President at the University of Idaho since December 2020. In this role, he serves as the university's Chief Academic Officer. Prior to that, Tori served as the Vice Provost for Faculty, Director of the Lionel Hampton School of Music, and Director of the university's marching band. An accomplished concert tubist, he has taught in our Lionel Hampton School of Music since 1998. Please join me in welcoming the University of Idaho Provost and Executive Vice President, Tori Lawrence, to the stage.
Thank you, Olivia. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Borah Symposium. We're glad you've joined us for what will surely be a wonderful event. For 75 years, the Borah Foundation has sponsored this annual event, which brings distinguished speakers from across the world to Moscow, Idaho, to address topics that touch our lives, such as war and peace. Tonight's keynote speaker will address some of the challenges to lasting peace. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Francisco Rafael Sagasti. Dr. Sagasti is a professor at the Universidad del Pacifico and a senior affiliated researcher at the Institute of Peruvian Studies. He was president of the Republic of Peru from November 2020 to July 2021 and served as a member of Congress there. He has also served as the chief of strategic planning at the World Bank, chairman of the United Nations Advisory Committee on Science and Technology, and visiting professor at the Wharton School and the University for Peace. Dr. Sagasti has published more than 200 papers and 25 books. That is a significant achievement. He received the Paul Hoffman Award, created in honor of the administrator of the Marshall Plan and first UNDP director. He also won the first Robert K. Merton Award of the International Sociological Association, as well as the Eduardo Habish Award, created in honor of the founder of the National Engineering School of Peru. Tonight, Dr. Sagasti will discuss the challenges he faced while serving as president of Peru, namely securing and distributing COVID-19 vaccines to his country at a time when they were scarce, highly coveted, and primarily in the hands of wealthier nations. Please join me in welcoming to the University of Idaho, Dr. Francisco Sagasti. Welcome.
First of all, thanks very much for the introduction, Mr. Provost, and also to the organizers of the 75th occasion of the Borah Symposium. It is really a great honor to be with you. I have read a little bit about Senator Borah and his efforts, wow, almost 100 years ago, and that he managed to create a program and a foundation that lives on 100 years ago is quite impressive. I think that this is a testimony of the interest that the university, that the foundation, and the community of the University of Idaho, the interest it has in peace, in development, in peaceful coexistence. As I've been talking to some of your student colleagues over the last several hours, and with some faculty members, I have realized, and I've told them, that I have a lot of things to share with you. Too many, actually. So the problem is how to select something that would make sense to you, that will be more or less coherent, I hope, rather than giving just pieces of information here and there, and then leave the question period to really go in depth in any of the issues that I will touch upon, or any other topic that you may be interested in. Yeah. The first thing I would like to stress is that we are living in in an epochal change. We are living in a change of epoch, not in an epoch of many little changes. What we are experiencing now is a fundamental shift in the way humanity is organized, in the way in which we carry out our activities, in the ways we interact with each other. Not since the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the beginning of the modern period, we have seen such a period of extraordinary change taking place at the same time. What is happening now is challenging practically all of our conceptions about human nature, human destiny, and in one way or another, they will end up modifying the prospects, the future prospects for our species. This is the first issue I want to touch. The second refers to international institutions and organizations. We have created, over the last several decades, an institutional arrangement, a system to deal with some of the challenges that humanity as a whole, regions and individual countries face. The problem we are facing is that those institutional arrangements appear to be insufficient to deal with the broad spectrum of challenges that we are facing now. That will be the second topic. Then I will cover very briefly a concept which economists are fond of, the concept of public goods, and how it has been extended to the idea of international public goods. And then from that concept, I will try to relate that to the challenges of organizing institutional arrangements to respond to the new situation we are experiencing. And then I will finish with a practical example of what is that we did in Peru during the pandemic, and in a very limited period of time, by the way. We had just close to 9 months in government, but we managed to achieve, and it's not for me to say, as the song goes there, it's not for me to say, but as Other points out, we did a few things that nobody else had done before in my country and probably elsewhere. Well, I mentioned that since the time of the Renaissance, we have not experienced so much change and turmoil. In the time of the transition from the Renaissance to the modern period. You remember at that time, the printing press was invented. And then all of a sudden, a larger number of people, common people, had access to text, had access to the Bible. They didn't have to rely on the interpretations that a small group of priests developed, organized, and used. It democratized that, but in the process changed quite a bit. One of the byproducts were the religious wars. And I'm sure that students of war know what they were at that time, the carnage. It was just one of the most horrible periods in human existence. Not only that, Columbus discovered America, Magellan went around the globe. Our conception of the world changed completely. And these are just two of the many changes that were associated with the development of modern science, of modern exploration, the acquisition of knowledge, the development of new technologies, and so on and so forth. Well, if you take a look at a marvelous book I would strongly recommend to you, it's an old book, but it's really very timely. It's Agnes Heller, a philosopher, a German-American philosopher, and the book is called Renaissance Man. And what she does in that book is to describe how ordinary people at that time of change felt the uncertainty, the fears, the problems, the mistrust, the hope, the determined to do things better. Well, this is what is happening to us at present. How to account for that? One of the things I've been working on for a very long time, as I told Olivia and her colleagues, is an interpretation that takes Sir Francis Bacon, the philosopher and statesman, the British philosopher and statesman, that in the late 16th century and early 17th century basically revolutionized modern science. He was not a practicing scientist, and the little he did was pretty bad. But he was a philosopher. He was the one that developed the approach, the methodology, the principles, the ways of going about it, the ethics of it, and so on, and was able to spread it widely through a variety of means. And Many years later, we can see with a retrospective perspective that what he did was what developed, or what philosopher Hans Jonas has called, the Baconian program. What was the Baconian program? A very simple statement used by Jonas to mobilize knowledge in order to improve the human condition. That was the simple idea. You remember he was the one that said, knowledge is power, General. And we know it pretty well, especially at a time when knowledge, intellectual property rights, and other things are determining how wars are fought, how conflicts are solved in one way or the other. So Bacon proposed that knowledge is power, and it has to be used in order to improve the human condition. Well, at the same time, he introduced some safeguards. He said, well, not all knowledge is good, some of it may be bad, and so on, but left it a little bit ambiguous in his writings. And he never wrote something, this is my program, I want it to be implemented. What I had to do, starting from Jonas and others, is to go back and read Bacon and try to figure out if he had, 500 years ago, decided to propose a program for humanity by reading all his texts and dispersed in his 14 volumes of complete works, what would he have articulated as a program? And I did that, and I won't bore you with the details, but the main thing is that that program of mobilizing knowledge in order to improve the human condition, and more important, to dominate nature through understanding. That was the idea. We are going to use our understanding to dominate nature. Well, it has been extraordinarily successful. We are the product of that. We are the product of the mobilization of scientific and technological knowledge and technological innovation in a variety of fields of result. It has led to improvements in the quality of life all over the world that were unthinkable hundreds of years ago. There is no question about that. At the same time, this domination of nature through understanding had some problems. When merged with expansion of the world economy, of the capitalist system of production in the 19th century, and many other things without safeguards, what it really gave is reckless exploitation of natural resources. We can see it with our eyes. For those like me who live in South America, can see how every day the Amazon forest is being cleared, destroyed in major ways, and not only the Amazon, everywhere. We can see the destruction of the human habitat in such a way and so pervasive that we are facing the problem of human extinction. People say, don't exaggerate. I mean, the human extinction, by the way, those of you scholars who really follow the development of disciplines may know that there is a discipline now called human extinction studies. When I say that, it's such an exaggeration. It's never going to happen. We have the capacity to adapt. I simply tell them, would a Neanderthal or would a Cro-Magnon answer the same thing? We replace them. They are extinct. Now, we don't know what is going to happen to our species. I'm not pessimistic, quite the contrary. I think we have enormous possibilities in the future, and not only enormous possibilities, but we know how to change the situation, but there are a lot of if and buts. One of the things that has happened as a result of the triumph of Bacon's program is that the patterns of human interactions have changed. For those the age of, I would say, about a quarter of those present here, who remember how it had to be booked. We had to book a telephone call across the Atlantic a day or hours in advance. This possibility of instant communication with everybody is totally jarring. It's something completely new. For you, young people, it's normal. You do it all the time. This is new. We don't know what is what this is doing to our own psyches, to our own ways of being, to be constantly exposed. We have seen what happens with social networks, with media in that way, and that we don't know. We have not developed as yet the set of values, the set of norms and standards that will allow us to deal in a productive and positive way with something that happened 10, 15 years ago. This is nothing in the history of humanity. It's even less in the history of the world. Well, I could go through automation, artificial intelligence, our conception of the universe, genetic engineering, the possibility of designing human beings, of choosing which genes our children are going to have. By the way, by the time some of you young ladies and young men have grandchildren, that will be a clear possibility. And then you'll have to make the choice what type of kid I want to have. We are not prepared for that. But that is a very distinct possibility. By the time you add it all up, this triumph of Bacon's program, in the process of altering our ways of being and living, is creating uncertainty, insecurity, lack of trust at all times. At individual and collective levels, our interactions are fraught with polarization, resentment, mutual contempt, disregard of the other, lack of dialogue. We tend to close by, and in those moments of uncertainty, we tend to cocoon in our own little group and reject the others, which is precisely the wrong attitude, the wrong answer to a tremendous question that our own development, our own success in the Baconian program has put in front to us. There is a wonderful quote from a Spanish philosopher, which I would like to say. It's in Spanish. It's Ortega y Gasset, who said, "No sabemos lo que nos pasa, y eso es lo que nos pasa." We don't know what is happening to us, and that is what is happening to us, not knowing what is happening to us. So one of the things we need to do is begin to understand what is really happening to us, and then from then on to go and devise better ways of arranging our own interactions. One of the ways of doing so, and here I go to the second part of my talk, is through the creation of international organizations and institutions that would be able to deal and cope with the problems created by this new situation we are facing. The current crop of international organizations that we have at present emerged out of World War II, very clearly. We had a very clear victor, a very clear situation. We had the creation of the United Nations after the failed attempt of the League of Nations, which emerged out of World War I. It didn't succeed. But the UN, after World War II, did succeed. We had the Human Rights Declaration approved in 1947, and since then it has done a lot of very good things. Of course, it has problems, difficulties, bureaucracy, and so on, but has succeeded in the most important thing it was tasked to do: avoiding nuclear annihilation. The UN has managed, and that was in the mind of those who initially were setting it up, by the way. So they have had their successes. These institutions are quite, some of them work reasonably well, but all of them are overwhelmed by the range of new problems, the range of new challenges that we are facing at the twilight of Bacon's age. It is quite clearly to me that we need to revamp these institutions, to rethink. And by the way, if you take a look at the newspapers, you will see attempts to how to modify the Security Council, and especially now with the war in Ukraine, the whole question of the veto is coming to focus once again. We are also seeing how is it that we can reorganize the United Nations Development Program, the UN itself. A few years ago, I did a study on how the budget of the UN General Secretariat was financed. How is it? And it was very interesting. The article that I wrote was called Power, purse and numbers. Where does power come from? And we'll see that later on in this talk. Where does power come from? From the purse, that who has the money, or from the numbers, from the majority? And the UN Secretariat has tried to reconcile those two, not always successfully, but to me, when I looked at it, it seemed almost a miracle that they have managed to do so, even for such a long time. So those institutions have served us well, but certainly they are not up to the challenges that we face today. So we need to rethink. And by the way, I'm not going to bore you with the detail. I myself have proposed many years ago new organizational structures for development cooperation, for military cooperation, for security arrangements, and so on and so forth. But I did that quite some time ago. What I have worked more recently is in a very interesting concept, the concept of international public goods as an entryway to redesign some of the international institutions to cope better with the challenges of the post-Baconian age that, whether we want it or not, we're already entering in, by the way. By the way, I use in my writings on this the concept of twilight, the twilight of Bacon's age. And in Spanish, it's not a very good translation. In English, it's perfect. Why? Because twilight has two meanings, dusk or dawn. In Spanish, it's just dusk. But at twilight, we can decide whether this twilight is going to be dusk or dawn to a new era. And that's the reason why I like this metaphor of twilight. By the way, for those of you who are close to my age will remember the Mills Brothers, and take a look at Just a Song at Twilight, a beautiful song that conveys the whole hope of what happens at twilight. Anyway, the concept of public goods was introduced, which, by the way, I will try to use it in order to begin, in order to show you an example of how this concept can be adapted to a current challenge. This concept was first put forward by an American economist, Paul Samuelson, the first Nobel Prize of Economics in 1954. And he called a public good, in the ideal sense, economists, and I hope I'm not offending any economists in the audience, tend to think purely in ideal concepts, not necessarily in practical things, theoretical, abstract, and so on. And the ideal concept of a public good is one that is characterized by non-rivalry. What does it mean? That consumption by one person does not prevent its enjoyment, use, or consumption by another. That's a public good. It has a second characteristic, which he called non-excludability. And non-excludability means that you cannot exclude from the use or enjoyment those persons that do not contribute to its generation, to the generation of a public good. You will ask for examples. The first example is security. If I am secure in one environment, you are also secure. And the fact that I'm insecure doesn't make you or you less secure. Second, if I provide secure for all, I cannot prevent someone who doesn't abide by the rules from enjoying that security. So that's non-excludability. And by the way, there were several examples of public goods that were put forward, and there were other characteristics, and I will just choose one, which is externalities. What happens with a public good is that those involved in their production and consumption, whether they want it or not, produce effects in others that are not involved in it at all. For example, negative externalities of the public bad, deforestation, of the public bad, sorry, how you call it, it went out of my mind, global warming gases, and the emission of gases and so on. Who suffers from that? Pakistan, Bangladesh. Who produces that? The US, China, Europe. So there are externalities. Some of them are positive and some of them are negative. But let's focus on the concept for just a minute. A public good is something which is non-rivalrous, it has no excludability, and it produces some externalities, some of them positive and some of them negative. I mentioned the example of security, peace, clean air, that the fact you breathe clean air doesn't prevent someone else from breathing it. That the fact that you really take care not to pollute with your car doesn't mean that someone who pollutes cannot enjoy the clean air. So these are some of the public goods: biodiversity conservation, macroeconomic stabilities and similar issues, and public health. The fact that we have a very good and working public health system allows everybody to take care of it, and it's not a pure public good because you can exclude some of them, either by payment, either by condition, and so on and so forth. What is remarkable about public goods? They do not exist on their own. You have to have the determination to name something and to define something as a public good with these characteristics, as I have just done. You need political action, you need political commitments, you need knowledge advances and institutional arrangements to security, for example. You require a political commitment to really enforce security. You require some knowledge about where the hotspots are in order to prevent crime and other things. I'm just talking about security, civic security. You need an organization, you need a police, you need surveillance systems and so on and so forth. So to provide that public good, I need a political decision, some knowledge, and I need institutional arrangements and financing arrangements. But you first have to make a political decision that, in this case security, you want it to be a public good and not, as you have in other places, when the police is ineffective, you have bodyguards and that's it. Go to Haiti. Go to some other countries in which security is not even an impure public good. So therefore, those are the three characteristics. Well, let me come to the punchline. Public health and the COVID pandemic is one situation, to call it that is amenable to the treatment through the concept of public goods. Let me explain in detail. Very early on, when the pandemic started, we knew that the best way of preventing its spread and of preventing that it infects people was to develop and apply vaccines. This has been, by the way, the history for a very, very long time. Since the 18th century, when Jenner applied the first vaccine, then we have known they are very good, in spite, I'm sorry to say, of the vaccine deniers. There is no question. Empirical evidence shows that conclusively, in a very clear sense. So the natural question was, how do we produce, first develop, then produce, then distribute and apply vaccines in the best possible way so that it acquires, to a certain extent, the characteristic of an international public good. This is a quite difficult challenge because it would have involved to develop, produce, distribute, and apply vaccines all over the world for everybody, not just a few. Well, what was done as a result of that, especially in a situation in which just a handful of countries invested in the development of those vaccines, financed with grants and donations the research that was necessary, which, by the way, was at warp speed. In no previous time in human history, a vaccine has been developed in about 9 months. They normally take at least 5 or 10 years. They did it in 6 to 9 months. By the end of 2020, we had at least 3 or 4 vaccines already in operation, one of them approved by the World Health Organization, and 2 others in January and February. This was most unusual. But because it had been financed primarily by high-income countries and by corporations, for-profit corporations in those countries, basically they took the decision to reserve those vaccines for themselves. As a partial answer, the COVAX facility was created. COVAX facility was an undertaking of 3 institutions, and let me just read them in clear sense because I don't want to quote their names wrong. One is the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, which is an international body. The other one's the Coalition for Preparedness and Development of Immunizations, CEPI. The other one was the World Health Organization, and the Gates Foundation contributed, as did some other governments. And what was the idea? Let's create a facility primarily for the benefit of the middle income and the poor countries of the world. What we'll do is to gather vaccines from the rich countries and from the private corporations, make a pool of vaccines, and then develop an algorithm to distribute them fairly to those countries that most need them. And we had 2 categories, well, not we, they had 2 categories. One for middle-income countries, in which they charged a very fair price per doses of vaccine. And for the poorest countries, there were outright donations, because they couldn't afford them. Brilliant idea. They developed the algorithm, they developed the priorities, and the main objective the COVAX facility had was to provide initially 20% of the vaccines required by the poorest countries and by the middle-income countries, at least 20% of the target population. You may remember that at the beginning, the target population was those over 18, because we weren't sure what the vaccine would do for younger people. But anyway, they had all of that in place. They, as of November, September, October, November, began to organize an allocation process in order to distribute the vaccines in a fair way. Well, let me quote just one practical example, my own country. What happened to us with the COVAX facility during time? By the way, one of the arguments for developing the COVAX facility was very clear. Which criteria should govern the allocation of vaccines? Should those high-income countries that had the financial, scientific, technological, and productive capacity to develop the vaccines should be the main ones to get access to it? Someone would say, well, no, we paid for it, so therefore it's ours. But is that fair? Is that sensible in an interconnected world like the one we are in? Moreover, in an interconnected world in which we have seen how the virus travels all over the world unchecked, there is no way you can, in spite of what the Chinese are trying to do, to put a Chinese wall, just to be redundant, and keep the virus out. The tremendous cost they had, is quite clear. So, should just the developed countries get it because they funded it and so on? Once again, the power of the purse or the power of the numbers and the need? It is an ethical dilemma. Well, COVAX tried to resolve that. And basically the argument is that the lives of human beings everywhere are worth the same. Anyway, that was the main concept. Unfortunately, this didn't work as well. In the case of my own country, Well, first of all, COVAX determined they need, how many doses of vaccines they need. It was something like 450 million doses in a very short period of time, in about 6 months' time, close to 500 million doses. Well, it got just a fraction of that. Not only they did not have the money to buy those that were prepared to sell them, it had no donations practically, just a few, and the result was that in spite of having led this allocation process that would be fair for everybody and equitable, after doing that, they had no vaccines to distribute. So they only gave very few. By the end of January 2021, end of January 2021, by that time, the vaccines had been applied for about 3 months. 99.9% of the vaccines had been applied in the high-income countries. By May or June of 2021, the percentage was about 90%. Now it is about 70% or so. So these inequalities persist. And in the case of my own country, Peru, thanks to the previous government, got an allocation of 13.2 million doses in September 2020. But with a catch, not one catch, many catches. The first one, we need to have the vaccines. If we don't have them, we cannot give them to you. The second one is, we have allocated that in such a way that the 13.2 million is enough for 20% of the target population of Peru, and we have done the same for all middle-income countries, and for which will pay a reasonable amount, and this 20% applies to the poorest countries who will pay nothing. So everybody was treated equally in one way or the other. Unfortunately, for the reasons that I just explained, by the end of my term, we had only received 1.6 million doses, almost 13% of the promised amount. Fortunately, we had to do something else, as I will describe very briefly in a minute. But this was a clear failure of an international institution designed with very good purposes, with great intent, but failed because of the structure of international relations, because of the structure of power relations, and the unwillingness of countries that had financed who had the power of the purse, at least to give a little bit to those that had the power of the numbers. In the end, the situation was even worse, because what the COVAX facility did is told you, you are going to get 13.2 million doses. Great! When? Who's going to give it to us? Wait a minute. You have to wait until I know how many doses we have. We have to wait until we know which laboratory is going to provide them. And then after that, you have to negotiate an individual contract with that laboratory. So you have only paid for a certain amount. You will eventually get it. But the conditions, the amounts, and the timing, you have to define with each of the laboratories. And the result was 1.2 million. So what is it that we try to do? Said, look, there is no way this can work for us. What is it that we can do in this situation? Well, the second best solution was to transform the vaccine into a national public good. That was my responsibility as president. We couldn't do more than that. So what we decided, and I can go into details if you want, is to engage in an extremely active process of international negotiations with 9 laboratories at the same time, with China, with Russia, with the US, with the UK, which were the main ones, with Germany later on, and it helps to have been chairman of the UN Advisory Committee on Science and Technology, mainly because I know a little bit about the psychology and the negotiating tactics of those groups. In the end, with 3 laboratories and after a laborious process, we managed to get vaccines from China, the Sinopharm, the first 1 million doses, which were applied to the health workers and to those people who were in the first line of defense. against. We negotiated with Pfizer, and after getting a trickle of doses through other things which I described to some of the students, we were able to get millions of doses in less than a few weeks. But this required a very complicated political decision, required strategic thinking and planning, required mobilizing resources for negotiation. When I think about what we had to do, I used to wake up at 4:30 in the morning and work on my own, and then join my team and try to figure out what was happening in the world and whether there was some way in which we could finally find a little bit of room to get that. By the way, I know this for some of the young people and not so young people, I was inspired for that by a Canadian philosopher, which I'm sure some of you know very well. Do you know songwriter Leonard Cohen? Well, if you take a look at YouTube and look at his introduction to the concert that he gave in London about 5 years or 6 years ago, in which he sang his song Anthem, he introduces them with the following words, which are an inspiration, by the way, even for people who hold political power. It says, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And the function of a leader at crisis times is to find those cracks that allow the light gets in. And this is what we did in Peru. The result was very simple. From 0 on 17th of November 2020, we went to 78 million doses on July 27, 2021, enough to vaccinate 3 times over the target population of the country. And in addition to that, and I haven't delved on it, we managed to do quite a few other things that complemented it. What is it that we did? In conceptual terms, we transformed that scarce international good into a national public good. Moreover, I got requests from the private sector, from health workers, from the judiciary. No, we have priority for the vaccination process because we were applying as they were coming in. And we said, no, we're going to set up a special ethics committee that will define the sequence of vaccination as the vaccine comes in purely on ethical grounds. First, we must take care of those who take care of us. Health workers, security workers. Second, the most vulnerable, the old and those who have comorbidities. Third, those who keep on coming down in terms of their age until we had enough doses that were arriving because of the negotiations that we did to vaccinate everyone before the end of 2021. What does it tell at least me? Even in complex and difficult situations, you can do something. You can find that crack through which the light gets in. You need a concept, you need a structure, you need a team. This was done by a marvelous team of people that I was able to assemble in 24 hours because my accession to the presidency came, by chance. Congress elected me after the president, like if the Speaker of the House takes over the presidency, it was just exactly the case with me. But we were able to do all of that. This has given me not the hope, but the certainty that if we put our minds, our energies to it, we can really address some of the challenges that we face, not only at the national level, but at the international level. And I think that what we are going to hear in the Borah Symposium now, which deals with international action and international collaboration for peace, for security, for development, and so on, is a crucial set of initiatives. And I do believe and not only believe, I know it can be done. When people tell me, no, 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 you are too optimistic. Sorry, I was going to say that bad word. I did it, so don't tell me it cannot be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if you wanted to ask question, please stand forward and then step forward and then ask your question. Please keep it short and concise so that we can have, at least 4 or 5 people before the end of the night. Thank you.
You know, I have all the time. I don't know about you. I'm happy to be with you.
It is such an honor to be able to ask you this question this evening. Through everything, through your presidency, do you believe that dealing with all the tough things that you had to deal with during the pandemic has taught you that human nature is kinder?
Sorry. Could you speak a little bit slower and louder? I'm hard of hearing.
Do you think that during your presidency and dealing with some of those tough decisions and making those calls, do you think it taught you that the people around you and just this human society as a whole is just nicer than we think?
Well, if I understand well the question, one of the things you have to do as a leader in this case is to surround yourself with pretty good people and good team. And this comes if you have spent time building relationships, building trust, getting to know people. You know, most cabinets, at least in my country, I don't know about the US, are usually riddled with rivalries, problems, and so on and so forth. The president, and we had a president that enjoyed pitting one minister against the other, so seeking his favor, and so on. There were cases of open conflict and so on. Nothing like that happened during my government. Why? Because I managed to keep a spirit of congeniality and working together. I didn't hector or lecture them, but I made sure that all of them really converge with a certain purpose. The wider lesson is this: there is nothing you can do on your own, just alone. And the military know that very well. And leadership and teamwork is essential. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So from your speech, I gathered your passion for sustainability and environmental conservation. So it's kind of a two-part question. How has your time as president changed your perspective in your country and with these specific problems with, conservation and all of that? So is there any specific events that occurred that made your perspective change to fight for conservation? And then what are some of those initiatives or changes that you did and fought for while you're in office?
Well, that's an easy question to answer. I was committed to conservation right for a long, long time. One of the things I can tell you, and this is one of the speeches I give, and I'm going to give in another place in Washington, and this is a very chauvinistic speech, if you wish, in the sense that has a Latin American and South American perspective. There is no other region of the world that has the wealth of natural resources that South America has. We have a diversity of forests, diversity of mineral resources, diversity of soils, diversity, and all of them in huge quantities of fisheries, diversity of energy sources, diversity of water. All of those are intimately related to the environment and require environmental sustainability. I've been preaching that for a very long, long time. In spite of the short time we had in government, we managed to get 7 new protected areas, environmentally protected areas, and to initiate quite a few, to start quite a few initiatives on environmental conservation. Unfortunately, environmental conservation is something that requires a very long time perspective, and we could just, scratch the surface. But at least one of the things I'm doing that is pushing the idea, preaching, if you wish. Now people ask me whether I am prepared to go back into politics again. I say that probably at the age I have, My role is better to talk with people like you, to transmit ideas, to transmit concepts, to go for environmental sustainability, for international cooperation. I know, and I have demonstrated it can work. So what I'm trying to do is motivate all of you to get involved in these types of initiatives. Thanks for your question.
And I just one more question specifically, was there an event that occurred in your life that was kind of eye-opening, that wanted you to
At the
fight for this?
presidency?
Just
in
in your
general?
lifetime that motivated you to act on that?
Every day.
Awesome. Thank you.
If you don't, if your life doesn't change at every moment through your interaction with other people, through reflection and so on, then you're not living a full life. You should change all the time.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Mercedes.
Could you bring the microphone down so you can hear?
Right
Sorry.
there. Good evening. My name is Mercedes Frausto, and I love my country, Peru.
Bien.
Gracias por estar aquí. Y mi pregunta es, what is the most significant contribution you made to the Peruvian government during your presidency?
People tell me, oh, it was the vaccines. No, it was to break the record on public investment for the last 15 years. No, it was making universal health available to all. You know, there were quite a few things. But I have a different perspective. I think that what I hope to have achieved is to demonstrate you can govern well, honestly, with commitment, with the public good in mind, with improvement of the whole community, and do that with a vocation for service, which is something that I learned. In a country like Peru, you know very well, unfortunately, all the other past presidents of my country are either investigation, in jail, indicted, or awaiting extradition. One committed suicide. I am the only one with a clean slate, and I want to show that it is possible to govern well, honestly, and thinking of the public good all the time. That's, to me, more important than any specific achievement.
Thank you.
Now you need to pull it up.
There we go. So talking about kind of the challenges and failures of international organizations, I wanted to know what was, I guess, like your experience with like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund relating structural adjustment programs, especially during the 80s and the 90s, and how have the World Bank and the IMF kind of improved from those programs, and like where are they going towards in the future? Also, thank you so much for coming here.
Yeah. Well, let me go back 30 years ago, when I was at the World Bank, but here is a very important question, because it's not just the World Bank. It has to do with the recommendations and advice given to other countries by international organizations, developed countries, and so on and so forth. What happened was that in the 1980s, we came from a wave of political and economic liberalization. After World War II, apart from creating new international organizations, one of the things that emerged very clearly is the conception of the welfare state, the possibility of creating a floor for everybody in terms of well-being that would allow them to progress at their own speed or according to their own abilities. And that this minimum floor was what the welfare state was supposed to provide through the public services, public education, health, public housing, and so on. Well, starting in the 1950s, in a little place called Chicago, a group of economists thought that this was a bad idea, and that the only way to make progress was that everybody should take care of himself or herself. and forget about the rest, forget about the floor, forget about the welfare state, and so on, and basically starting to think in the 50s and continuing through the 60s and 70s. By the 1980s, those ideas had become public policy, especially in the United Kingdom and in the US. What is worse, that it led to a spat of, here we are at a higher education institutions. I know it because of my former students. I used to teach at the Universidad del Pacífico, and most of them went to get their graduate degrees in the 80s in the US and the UK. Well, the mantra was, the state is bad, the state is a disaster, all the evils of the world comes because of state intervention. Only sort of greed is good, you remember Gordon Gekko? Yeah, that's the only thing that is going to save the world. Well, that, whether they like it or not, permeated, not in that extreme case, but basically the primacy of the market over everything else began to permeate international institutions and the World Bank. I had a fight, I remember, with T.N. Srinivasan, and those of you who are economists know his name, when we were preparing the 1991 World Development Report. It used to be almost a joke, because the sort of convener and the writer of the report will come for a discussion and say, well, let's figure out on the subject of health and education. On this corner, T.N. Srinivasan. On that corner, Francisco Sagasti. Now, let's discuss about it. Well, what has happened is that some of that advice has turned out to be really wrong. It has created more problems, and we are now seeing the effects. Inequality at levels that we hadn't seen before, polarization on a political group that decides, that not only greed is all, but I am the supreme being and everybody else around me will work with me and that's it. And then the rest are just, forget about them. It's, this is what has led to many of the social, political, environmental problems. I do hope and I do believe, and by the way, the World Bank, the IMF, when I said earlier that international organizations are changing, they themselves are now putting forward. The IMF just made a major paper and contribution on biodiversity conservation, something that was completely out. When I was Chief of Strategic Planning of the World Bank, I had to sort of, to referee a discussion about democracy and authoritarian governments. Why? Because, as in the 80s, democracy doesn't matter. What matters is efficiency. And authoritarian governments and dictatorships are more efficient than democracies. That was the creed among some people in the bank. Well, I wrote a paper saying, that's illusory sort of efficiency. It doesn't work, mainly because it is imposed, it's not internalized by people. And the moment you impose something and someone else comes and says something else, you have nothing at stake in maintaining it. So many of those reforms are bogus in there. So what I argued was democratic governance are for the internalization of those principles in democratic practices. And this is what I tried to do in my country since 1990 onwards, when I left the bank. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, I lowered a little bit. So you said that Bacon's primary goal was to mobilize knowledge for the improvement of the human condition, and secondarily to dominate nature with that knowledge. So my question, is there a provision or a responsibility on humanity's part to also improve the natural conditions? Specifically, if our domination of the world causes it harm, can we justify harming the environment or harming nature in exchange for improving the human condition?
Oof. You have had a question that has been debated, but it's very interesting. There has been in 2000s a huge debate around Bacon's legacy. There is a group of feminist ecologists who really tried to trash Bacon, and a group of male scholars who try to defend it in there, because Bacon used a metaphor of the rape of nature even, and so on. Well, if you read Bacon, as I have done, first of all, he was a multifaceted guy, and he was not always consistent. He was coherent, but consistency is hobgoblin of small minds, would you remember? So sometimes he said one thing, sometimes the other. But if you see the undercurrent of his thinking and his actions, he basically had a broader perspective. Environment didn't figure at that time. Remember, world population was a few 100 million. And what happened is that you could trust the natural regenerative capacities of ecosystems that support life. You could use a lot of resources, a lot of energy, no problem. You could throw, you could produce a sort of greenhouse gases and throw, the natural. But when human activity began, first of all population, and then human activity, especially after the mid-19th century, began to increase exponentially, we got into a situation that it has been estimated by ecologists that in 1975 to 1980, we overpassed the capacity of natural ecosystems to regenerate themselves. So this requires active intervention, not only to recuperate lost environments, but to make sure that nothing that we do in the future harms them. And this is the dilemma that we have at present, for example, with oil and gas and the invasion of Ukraine and so on and so forth. Because here you have a big question. I mean, will wealthy Germans be prepared to reduce the standards of living during this terrible winter for the sake of the rest of humanity or not? These are some of the tests we're going to be facing in the future. And this is when, nationalism, egoism, there is in Spanish a say, ande yo caliente y ríase la gente. If I am warm, I don't care if everybody laughs at me or hates me. Well, we have to prevent that from becoming the dominant mode of thinking. Because if we do that, in the end, we'll just simply go to extinction, all of us. And those guys, those extremely wealthy guys, I don't know whether you have seen the news of those huge, super rich tycoons buying islands and building sort of special kind of bomb shelters, of nuclear shelters, or environmental shelters. That's balderdash. That's not going to save them. Others are thinking, well, I will upload my brain to a computer. Others are thinking, I'm going to go to another planet, an exoplanet. Come on, use your brains and your money to really address the problems that are here and now, and that are solvable with a little bit of, I would say, no, with a little bit of luck, no, with a little bit of will. And in order to have the will to do that, first you have to become aware of the threats that we are facing. And, but there is a way out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. My big question is, you've done a lot of things and you encourage everyone that there is a way to improve something. But for young people who are trying to find their way to help the world, how would you say that they can go about finding their special niche or area that they can actually make a difference in?
That is a very difficult question to pose to a father of 7, grandfather of 9, and great-grandfather of 4. Let me see. First, one of the things that I have been thinking about and working recently is how does one go about making decisions when one faces a situation or a problem, whether it is an economic, a family, a person, a military problem. And basically what I have come to the conclusion, based on the work of some of my mentors, teachers, and so on, whom I don't have time to recognize, but it's about 2 pages in the book I am writing on that particular chapter. And it's a combination of 3 things that you need to develop. The first one is mindset. And what is mindset? Mindset is the repertoire of concepts with which you apprehend reality. If you have a very limited set of concepts, you're going to see reality through a very small window. If you really have a broad range of concepts, you'll be able to see all the nuances, all the little shades, difference, and so on, and have a much richer, because you have the mental equipment, the mentality. That's one thing. The second one is character. Is what are your values, your principles, and they refer primarily on how do you relate first to yourself and then to the people that surround you in ever-expanding circles. So how do I deal with others? Do I trust them? Do I love them? Do I exert solidarity, empathy, and so on and so forth? That's character. And then the third one is evidence. What are the facts? What is the data? What is it that I'm going to use? And the combination of mindset, character, and evidence in data is the one that when you put all of them together, whether you realize or not, those are the factors that intervene in every decision that you make, even which door are going to use on the way out here, or even what career you will pursue. So, what is the answer? Expand your mindset. Get as many concepts as you can. Read other things. Look away from your own specialty and try to understand the ways in which other people think, and so on. Character, mold yourself. Reflect on what is it you're doing. Try to acquire self-confidence. If you are not self-confident, you will never be confident on anything. You will not be able to trust anybody. How does it done? Well, through little acts in there that allow you to see who you really are and to like yourself. That is essential. And evidence, well, you need, first of all, at least a smattering of statistics in order to understand all the data that we have that. You know, an introductory course in statistics, I strongly recommend that to you. That will allow you even to understand the opinion polls and to be able to question them with more property. But it's not only statistics, it's sources of information. We live in an era of disinformation. We see the sort of the bogus facts being disseminated all the time. So you need to acquire the capacity to discern what are the criteria that allow me to be confident and have the mindset in order to appreciate properly a situation with the evidence that I have. So this is what I just proposed to a university in Peru, that what they should do with undergraduate students is to make sure that in the first 3 or the first 2 years of general studies, they learn how to develop their mindset, how to develop their character, and the capacity to understand evidence. With that basis, you can go almost in any direction, regardless of which profession or activity you want to pursue in the future.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for questions.
Yeah, go down. Or do I stay here? Please.
Hello. I'm Dave Gottwald, Chair of the Borah Symposium Committee. Just want to remind you that tomorrow, Lieutenant General Eric C. Peterson's talk will be here in this room, right? 12:30. Regret to inform you that the Prince was unable to travel to give his keynote address tomorrow. We were in negotiation with him about some dates for the spring, so we will have the Prince here on campus, but that event will not be happening tomorrow night. We will have the Lieutenant General's talk at 12:30. Thank you all for attending this evening.